Have you ever stood in a room so quiet that you could hear the sound of your own heartbeat, feeling like a ticking time bomb, waiting for the perfect moment to detonate? That is exactly how it felt in that high-rise conference room in Manhattan. Outside, the city was moving at its usual frantic pace, sirens blaring and people rushing to get somewhere. But inside, time had completely frozen. I sat at the head of the heavy, dark mahogany table, a glass of ice-cold water in front of me that I hadn't even touched. I wasn't thirsty. I was merely watching. Across from me sat my children, Ethan and Chloe. They were dressed in the kind of expensive, tailor-made suits that scream money, but whispered shallow. Ethan, at 32, was checking his luxury watch for the third time in 5 minutes, his eyes darting toward the door, as if he had somewhere far more important to be. Chloe, 28, was scrolling through her phone, her thumb moving with a robotic, habitual speed. They looked bored. They looked entitled. They looked like two people who had spent their entire lives assuming the world was designed to cater to their every whim. They were here for a signature. They were here for the final payout, the keys to the kingdom they believed they had rightfully earned by simply existing. I didn't say a word. I just waited. There is a power in silence that most people are terrified of, but in my line of work, silence is the ultimate weapon. It forces the other person to fill the void, and usually, that's when they reveal exactly who they are. I watched Ethan tap his designer loafers against the expensive carpet. I saw the impatience etched into the lines of his forehead. They thought we were here to finalize the estate, to divide the assets, and to get back to their lives of yacht trips and board meetings. They had no idea that the meeting was already over before it had even begun. I slid the document across the polished surface of the table. It didn't slide far. It stopped right in front of Ethan. He glanced at the title, his face relaxed for a fraction of a second, expecting to see the distribution plan he had been harassing my lawyers about for weeks. Then, his eyes narrowed. He looked at the words, read them once, blinked, and then read them again. The color drained from his face so quickly that he looked almost ghostly. He pushed the paper toward Chloe, his hand trembling slightly. When she read the title, Amendment to Last Will and Testament, Final Disinheritance, the air in the room seemed to vanish. The silence I had cultivated was no longer heavy. It was suffocating. I finally leaned back, interlacing my fingers. I didn't smile. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. "I'm not signing it, Ethan," I said, my voice steady, calm, and perfectly controlled. "Not today. Not ever. You didn't come for the inheritance. You came for the payday. And I'm afraid that account has been closed." The look in their eyes shifted from irritation to genuine shock, and then, slowly, to a realization that their entire world had just tilted on its axis. They didn't know it yet, but I had spent the last few months dismantling their lives piece by piece, and this was just the final brick falling. People often ask me how I developed such a cold, analytical mind, one that allows me to look at my own children and see nothing but liabilities. It started long before I had the corner office or the views of the Manhattan skyline. I grew up in a world where things weren't handed to you. I spent 3 decades in the trenches of corporate litigation, a field where emotions are a weakness and facts are the only currency that matters. I was the guy firms called when they needed to bury a problem or expose a lie. I learned early on that everyone has a price and everyone has a secret. The trick is just being the one to find the paper trail that connects the two. My life was a blueprint of discipline. While other fathers were taking their kids to baseball games or soccer practice, I was reviewing contracts, drafting arguments, and mastering the art of the deposition. I built my firm from a tiny, drafty office with a second-hand desk into an empire. I sacrificed weekends, birthdays, and anniversaries to ensure that my family would never know what it was like to worry about a bill. I gave them every privilege I never had. I sent them to the best schools, bought them the finest clothes, and opened doors for them before they even knew they wanted to walk through. But in doing so, I made a fatal mistake. I gave them everything, but I forgot to teach them the value of the things that money cannot buy. I taught them how to spend, but I never taught them how to care. My wife Eleanor was the one who held the heart of the family together. She was the warmth in our home, the person who made sure we were actual human beings rather than just successful figures on a spreadsheet. When she got sick, I stayed by her side. I watched her fade, day by day, while Ethan and Chloe stayed in the background, only checking in when they needed an infusion of cash or a new investment for some business venture they were currently chasing. They were professional children. They were good at smiling for the cameras and showing up for the holidays. But when the real crisis hit, when Eleanor needed them the most, they were nowhere to be found. They had better things to do. They had yachts to charter and board meetings to attend. I thought I had raised them to be independent, but I realized too late that I had only raised them to be consumers. They were sharks, circling a wound, waiting for the body to drop so they could feast on what was left. And that is where they made their mistake. They thought that because I was a father, I was a fool. They forgot that for 30 years, I have been the one who writes the rules of the game. The months leading up to Eleanor's death were not just a time of grief. They were an education. My wife was in the hospice ward, her light dimming a little more each day, and I spent every waking moment at her bedside, holding her hand, reading to her, and listening to the stories she was still strong enough to share. I kept Ethan and Chloe updated, of course. I sent emails, I made the calls, and I gave them the progress reports on her health. I wanted them to know, to understand, and hopefully to be present. That was the mistake, thinking that blood automatically meant loyalty. Ethan was the first one to offer an excuse. He was in Dubai, he said, locked in a series of mandatory board meetings that would determine the future of his holding company. He sent me flowers, an expensive, impersonal arrangement that arrived in a glossy box. It was a gesture designed to look like he cared, but it was hollow. I knew his schedule. I had access to his itinerary. He wasn't in meetings. He was spending his days on high-speed desert buggies and his nights in clubs that cost more per bottle than my first car. He was busy, all right, just not with anything that mattered. Then there was Chloe. She was in Saint-Tropez, soaking up the sun on a yacht that belonged to a man she had met only a few weeks prior. She was posting photos to her social media accounts, perfectly curated images of her sipping champagne, wearing designer sunglasses, and laughing as if the world was a playground. I remember looking at one of her posts, a picture of her reclining on the deck with the Mediterranean blue behind her, and noticing the timestamp. It was the same morning Eleanor had slipped into a coma. I looked at the photo, not with anger, but with a terrifying kind of clarity. She wasn't just disconnected, she was choosing to be invisible. But it wasn't the partying that broke the final thread of my patience. It was the timing. While Eleanor was in the hospital, fighting for her final breaths, the estate executor, a man I have known for 20 years, called me with a strange inquiry. He told me that both Ethan and Chloe had contacted him separately, asking about the possibility of an early release from the trust fund. They weren't calling to ask how their mother was doing. They weren't calling to ask if they should come home to say goodbye. They were calling to ask for money. They were calculating the inheritance like it was an account they could withdraw from at a bank teller's window. I began to dig, not because I was paranoid, but because I needed to know the depth of the rot. I started going through the shared accounts, the ones I had set up years ago, to teach them financial responsibility. What I found was a map of their selfishness. Chloe had been siphoning money from Eleanor's personal charitable account. She called it administrative fees for the events she allegedly planned, but there were no events. The money was just disappearing into her lifestyle. New clothes, jewelry, expensive dinners. It was petty theft, the kind that shows a complete lack of respect for the person whose name was on the account. Ethan was more ambitious. He had forged a signature on a document regarding a vacation property we owned, trying to leverage it for a business venture that was clearly doomed to fail. He thought he was clever. He thought he was playing the game, using his father's assets to build his own kingdom. He didn't realize that in my office, we keep copies of everything. Every signature is verified, every transaction is logged, and every lie leaves a digital footprint. I watched them in the weeks following the funeral, acting the part of the grieving children. They put on their black suits. They stood at the graveside with their heads bowed, and they even shed a few tears. But I knew exactly where they had been, and more importantly, I knew exactly who they were. They were not my children. They were vultures in tailored wool, and watching them play, act their sorrow over their mother's grave, was the final piece of evidence I needed to change the course of their future forever. The performance was excellent, but they had forgotten that I was the one who had written the script, and I was certainly the one who could edit it. Most people find comfort in distractions when they are grieving, but I have always found comfort in order. While the rest of the world expected me to retreat into a dark room and wallow in my loss, I did the opposite. I retreated into my home office, a space defined by glass, mahogany, and silence. This was where I had fought the battles of my professional life, and this was where I would fight the last battle of my personal one. I didn't need to cry. I needed to calculate. I needed to see exactly how far my children had drifted from the values I thought I had instilled in them. I spent the next 3 months treating my own family like a hostile takeover. I didn't rely on guesswork or hearsay. I relied on the cold, hard reality of documents. I hired a private forensic accountant, a man I had used on complex corporate fraud cases for years. I didn't tell him they were my children. I simply handed him a list of entities and names and asked for a comprehensive audit of their financial behavior over the last 2 years. I told him to look for irregularities, unauthorized transactions, and any sign of financial desperation. I wanted the facts to speak for themselves, without the bias of a father's love or the sting of a father's disappointment. The reports started arriving in thick, white envelopes. Every evening, I would sit at my desk, pour a glass of water, and slowly dissect the evidence. It was an autopsy of their character. I had expected to find immaturity or poor spending habits, but what I found was systematic greed. Chloe, my daughter, had been a master of small-scale deception. For the past 18 months, she had been systematically raiding Eleanor's personal charitable account. She had set up a fake vendor, a shell company with an address that led to a post office box in another state. She was invoicing the charity for consulting services and event planning that never took place. The amounts were small enough not to trigger an immediate audit, just a few $1,000s here and there. But they added up. She was stealing from her own mother's legacy, using the money to pay for her luxury lifestyle, while her mother was fighting for her life in a hospital bed. Ethan's betrayal was more aggressive. He was playing a bigger game. He had taken it upon himself to forge my signature on several high-value property documents. He had tried to leverage the equity in our vacation home in the Hamptons to secure a business loan for a tech startup that existed mostly on paper. He had bypassed my legal counsel, used a corrupt notary who had since lost their license, and created a web of debt that tied our family's assets to his failing ventures. He thought he was playing the long game, betting that I would eventually sign off on the deals once he presented them as accomplished successes. He underestimated my attention to detail. I review every line of every document that bears my name, and I noticed the discrepancy in the signature line the moment the bank sent a routine confirmation notice. I spent hours mapping their movements against their financial activity. I overlaid their bank statements with their social media posts. The contrast was sickening. On the days Chloe was posting photos of herself at high-end spas, she was withdrawing money from the charity account. On the days Ethan was bragging about his successful board meetings in Dubai, he was scrambling to cover overdraft fees and wire transfer failures. They weren't just living beyond their means, they were living entirely at my expense, all while treating me like a nuisance to be avoided until the next payout. I compiled everything into a single, comprehensive dossier. It was a beautiful, terrifying piece of work. I had tabs for bank records, verified emails, copies of the forged documents, and a timeline of their location data. It was an airtight case. Any judge, any lawyer, or any jury would see exactly what I saw. Two adults who had abandoned their family, committed fraud, and acted with a level of malice that was truly impressive in its scope. I didn't feel anger while putting this together. Anger is a volatile emotion. It burns out quickly and leads to mistakes. What I felt was a strange sense of clarity. I was closing a case file that had been open for 28 years. As I stacked the final report on my desk, I realized that I wasn't just exposing them, I was setting them free. They had been living in a bubble of entitlement, believing that they could do whatever they wanted without consequences. I was about to provide them with the ultimate lesson. They wanted to be independent, to handle their own affairs, and to make their own way in the world. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. I was going to hand them their own freedom, stripped of all the resources they had used to disguise their lack of character. The investigation was over, the evidence was incontrovertible, and the only thing left to do was to present the truth in the only place they would have to listen, the conference room. The conference room felt like a vacuum. It was as if all the oxygen had been sucked out, leaving only the weight of the truths I had laid on the table. Ethan was the first to try and recover. He pushed his chair back, his face a mask of indignation that didn't quite reach his eyes. He started talking about family loyalty, about how I was being cold, about how I was overreacting to minor misunderstandings. He threw around words like inheritance and rights as if they were shields. I let him talk. There is nothing more satisfying than watching a person dig their own grave while they think they are building a bridge. When he finally stopped, breathless and clearly agitated, I simply opened the first folder of the dossier. I didn't need to shout to get their attention. The silence of the room did the work for me. I slid a document toward Ethan, the copy of the forged property loan agreement. I tapped a single small detail with my pen. It was the notary's signature, the one from the disgraced official. I watched his eyes track my movement. The indignation vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, sharp spike of fear. He didn't speak. He couldn't. "You see, Ethan," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "a signature is just ink on paper, but a forged signature is a felony. In my world, we call that fraud. In the real world, it's a one-way ticket to a courtroom that doesn't care about our last name." I didn't look at him when I said it. I looked at the table, my expression as neutral as if I were discussing a lunch menu. The air in the room seemed to vibrate with his sudden panic. He looked at Chloe, desperate for her to say something, to intervene, but she was staring at the paper as if it were a bomb. I turned my attention to Chloe. She was trying to shrink into her oversized designer blazer. I didn't need to pull out the charity files for her to know what was coming. I just mentioned the name of the shell company she had created. The color didn't just drain from her face. She looked like she had seen a ghost. Her hands, which had been tapping on her phone earlier, were now knotted in her lap. "The charity fund was your mother's pride," I said, my voice steady and devoid of judgment. She believed in those causes. She trusted you to manage those resources. Instead, you turned it into your personal shopping account. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger implies that I still expected something from them. I didn't. I was merely stating facts, like a surgeon explaining the nature of a wound. You didn't just steal money, Chloe. You stole the one thing that held us together as a family: trust. The shift in the room was palpable. They weren't fighting for an inheritance anymore. They were fighting for their lives. The arrogance they had walked in with had evaporated, leaving behind two scared, selfish people who had finally realized they were outmatched. They had built their entire world on the assumption that I was a safety net, an endless supply of cash and protection that would always be there to catch them when they fell. They had treated me like a bank, not a father. The trust, I continued, closing the folder, is gone. I saw the shock hit them, a physical blow that made them slump in their chairs. It wasn't an inheritance, and it certainly wasn't a piggy bank for your lifestyle. It was a legal instrument, and because you both engaged in unauthorized activity, siphoned assets, and committed financial fraud, the trust has been dissolved to cover the damages you created. Every cent you borrowed, every invoice you fabricated, has been clawed back. The remainder of the estate has been redirected. Ethan tried to stand up, his face turning a deep shade of red. He opened his mouth to protest, to threaten, maybe to bargain. "You can't do this," he spat out, his voice cracking. "This is our money. You have no right." I didn't flinch. I didn't even look up. I just held up a hand, a single gesture that silenced him instantly. It was the same gesture I had used to stop opposing counsel for 30 years. "I have every right," I corrected him, my tone clinical. "I built this estate. I managed these assets, and I defined the terms of the trust. If you don't like the outcome, you are welcome to take this up with the executor. But I should warn you, he is the one who filed the reports of your fraud to the authorities. You aren't negotiating with me anymore. You are dealing with the consequences of your own choices." The realization finally hit them. They weren't being disinherited as an act of cruelty. They were being cut off because they had become legal liabilities. Their faces went pale, their eyes wide with the sudden, crushing weight of their new reality. They had lost everything, not just the money, but the safety, the status, and the protection they had taken for granted their entire lives. And the worst part for them wasn't the loss of the money. It was the absolute, icy indifference with which I had taken it all away. The aftermath was swifter and more clinical than they had anticipated. Ethan and Chloe left my office with threats, empty, desperate vows of legal retaliation that rang hollow against the solid marble floors of the building lobby. They tried to contest the amendment, of course. They hired a firm that specializes in high-stakes family litigation, banking on the idea that a grieving, older man could be pressured into a settlement. They didn't understand that I hadn't just prepared a will. I had prepared a fortress. My legal counsel, a man who has spent his career dismantling corporate empires, didn't even break a sweat. He laid out the evidence of their fraud, the forged signatures, the siphoned charity funds, the documented patterns of deceit, and the litigation firm dropped them within 48 hours. They realized, just as Ethan and Chloe should have, that there was no case to be made when the truth was so blatantly documented. The social fallout was just as absolute. Their world was built on a foundation of appearances, a fragile facade held together by the money I had provided. Once the credit lines were severed and the trust was dissolved, the facade began to crumble. The people they called friends, the socialites in Saint-Tropez, the business partners in Dubai, were never actually their friends. They were colleagues in a transaction, attracted to the lifestyle that my capital had sustained. When they realized that Ethan and Chloe were no longer conduits for easy money and influence, they vanished. The board meetings they were so proud of, those doors closed the moment their background checks came back with red flags. Without the buffer of the estate, they were suddenly just two people with no assets, no reputation, and no skills to survive in the real world they had spent their lives avoiding. I watched it all from a distance, with the same detached interest one might have while reading an obituary in the morning paper. There was no joy in their downfall, only a sense of completion. I had spent years trying to fill a void in them with money, thinking that security would eventually lead to maturity. I was wrong. I had only been feeding a hunger that could never be satisfied. They were so busy chasing the symbols of success that they never bothered to develop the character required to maintain it. They wanted the yacht, the board seat, and the prestige, but they were unwilling to pay the price of admission, which is simply honesty. Returning to my house in the weeks that followed was a strange experience. The rooms were empty, the halls were silent, and for the first time in decades, there was no one asking me for anything. There were no demands on my time, no schemes to evaluate, and no betrayals to anticipate. It was quiet. Most people would call that loneliness, but I found it to be the most profound sense of peace I have ever known. I walked through the study, looking at the books Eleanor had loved, and the photos of a family that had existed only in my own optimistic imagination. I realized then that I hadn't actually lost my children. I had simply stopped paying for their presence. People like to believe that blood is thicker than water, or that family is unconditional, but I have learned that even the closest relationships are, in their own way, transactional. We show up for those we respect, and we stay for those who challenge us to be better. When you remove the veneer of obligation, you are left with the raw truth of who people really are. My children were people who would have sold me out for a slightly larger slice of the pie. Recognizing that didn't break me. It liberated me. Money is a powerful tool, but it is a terrible substitute for love or character. It can buy you comfort, it can buy you status, and it can buy you access, but it cannot buy you loyalty. Loyalty is earned in the quiet moments, in the way you treat people when no one is watching, in the sacrifices you make when there is no reward, and in the courage you show when things get difficult. My children never learned that, and I suppose, in the end, that is the only true failure on my part. I gave them a map to a treasure, but I failed to teach them how to walk the path to get there. As I sit here now, looking out over the city, as the sun begins to set, I don't feel a need to look back. The case is closed. The books are balanced. The lesson has been delivered, and whether they choose to learn from it or let it destroy them is entirely their own responsibility. I have realized that the greatest inheritance I could ever provide was not the money and the trust, but the lesson that actions have weight, and that your life is defined by the choices you make when the stakes are at their highest. I have my silence, I have my peace, and for the first time in a very long time, I have nothing left to prove to anyone.